In 1938, a check worth only $4 forever changed the fate of one of the greatest icons in music and forged in a boy hungry for success the fuel that would turn him into the king of rock. This story of pain, abandonment, and redemption begins in Tupelo, Mississippi, and reveals why Elvis never forgot where he came from. While the world didn't yet know who Elvis Presley was, a 3-year-old boy watched his mother cry as his father was taken to jail. That day in Tupelo didn't just mark a poor family from Mississippi, it marked the birth of one of the most passionate souls in the history of music. And maybe if Vernon Presley hadn't been arrested, the world would never have known the king. Visions of the past, symbolic images of poverty and a simple guitar, stand in contrast to the glamorous reign that would come later. Have you ever asked yourself this question? How can misfortune completely change a person's life? Stay with me and I'll tell you every detail. It all began with a simple, almost trivial mistake, but one that would change the course of an entire family. In 1938, Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, was arrested for forging a check worth only $4. $4! A small amount, but back then, in the heart of Mississippi during the Great Depression, it was enough to feed a family for weeks. And this event left deep scars on a boy of only 3 years old, shaping the mind and heart of the one the world would later call the King of Rock. The story takes place in Tupelo, a small town in the American South. The region lived through dark days. The U.S. economy was still trying to recover from the 1929 crash, and poverty was almost a natural condition in rural areas. Vernon and Gladys Presley were simple people. They worked hard, lived in a small wooden house built with their own hands, and dreamed only of the basics: safety, a home, and hope for a better future for little Elvis. But fate seemed to test that family at every step. Even before Elvis was born, the Presleys' life had already been marked by loss. He came into the world on January 8, 1935, but his twin brother, Jesse Garon, was stillborn. The trauma of that loss caused his mother, Gladys, to develop an almost supernatural attachment to the son who survived. She protected him from everything, seeing in him a reason to keep going. Elvis grew up surrounded by intense love, but also by fear and insecurity. Fear of poverty, fear of loss, fear of the unknown. Vernon did what he could. He worked on farms, sold milk, took odd jobs, but the money was never enough. Bills piled up, and opportunities were scarce. Then, in an act of desperation, he made the mistake that changed everything. Needing to pay off a debt, Vernon took a check for $4, altered it to $40, and tried to pass it off as payment. His employer discovered the forgery and showed no mercy. In an era when check fraud was seen as a serious crime, especially in rural Mississippi, the sentence was harsh: 3 years in prison. Little Elvis was just 3 years old when he saw his father taken away. For a child, there's no understanding of justice or morality, only absence. Overnight, the man who represented safety disappeared, and the Presley home fell apart. Gladys was left alone, without income, without a home, and without a clear path. She and her son lived off the charity of relatives and neighbors, constantly moving, dependent on others' kindness. The memories of that time would haunt Elvis like ghosts. Later, he would tell close friends that the sound of his mother crying was one of his earliest memories. While Vernon served his sentence at Parchman Penitentiary, one of the harshest in the South, Gladys faced the brutal reality of survival. There was no room for dreams. Each day was a battle for food, shelter, and dignity. Little Elvis grew up watching his mother sacrifice herself, always with tired eyes, but unshaken faith. She believed her husband would return and that life somehow would get better. That simple, unbreakable faith would become one of the greatest gifts she left her son. After about 8 months, Vernon was released, thanks to a pardon from the governor of Mississippi. He came home with shame written on his face and a silent promise never to put his family through that again. But the emotional damage was already done. That period of absence had left invisible scars. Elvis grew up with a constant sense of instability, a mistrust of life, and a deep fear of poverty. He knew what it meant to lose everything, and it would mark him forever. The episode also strengthened the bond between mother and son. The relationship between Elvis and Gladys became one of the most intense and well-known in music history. It was a near symbiotic love built on the shared pain of separation and struggle. Vernon, on the other hand, carried both guilt and pride. He knew his mistake had shaped his son's character in ways he might never understand. Vernon Presley's imprisonment wasn't just an isolated event. It was the beginning of a mindset that would guide Elvis for the rest of his life. The fear of returning to poverty drove him to work tirelessly, to chase success with a near-desperate hunger. Behind the charisma and brilliance of the star was a boy from Tupelo who knew what it was to go hungry, to lose his father, and to see his mother fight alone. That boy grew up with a silent promise to make sure his family would never again experience the pain he had known when the man he loved was taken away for a $4 mistake. When Vernon Presley came home in 1939, he didn't find the same family he had left. Gladys was different. The sparkle in her eyes had been replaced by an expression of exhaustion marked by the daily struggle to survive. And Elvis, now 4 years old, was beginning to understand what it meant to grow up surrounded by uncertainty. The Presley household would never be the same again. The fear of scarcity became a permanent guest in that small wooden house in Tupelo. The father's imprisonment had left something unseen but deeply felt, an invisible scar that would shape the son's destiny. In the years that followed, the family tried to rebuild. Vernon looked for work in farms and sawmills, always bearing the weight of suspicion. In the American South, a man who had been to prison was rarely forgiven. The Presley name carried a shadow. Gladys did everything she could to keep her dignity, sustained by the faith that had seen her through hardship. She was a woman of pure heart who believed life still held something good for her son. Elvis grew up in that environment of love and difficulty, learning that nothing came easy and that everything worth having had to be fiercely protected. Around the age of 11, Elvis began showing interest in music. The church they attended was one of their few distractions, and the only place where the boy felt free. There, he sang, watched the musicians, and instinctively learned the power of emotion through voice. Singing was more than artistic expression. It was refuge. Each note was a way of turning pain into hope. The faith his mother cultivated blended with music, and that combination became the foundation of Elvis's identity. It was around this time that a small event would forever change his story. On one birthday, Elvis asked for a bicycle. Money was tight, and Vernon couldn't afford it. Gladys, with what little she had, decided to buy her son a guitar instead. It cost just under $13. When Elvis held that instrument for the first time, he didn't know a single chord, but in his hands was the symbol of his family's resilience. That guitar represented more than music. It was the materialization of a silent vow that he would never again allow poverty or shame to touch the people he loved. And you, do you believe that this simple gift, a guitar instead of a bicycle, was the true turning point in the king's life? Tell us in the comments what this moment means to you. In the following years, the Presleys' financial situation worsened. The lack of work and growing debts forced Vernon and Gladys to make a difficult decision. In 1948, they left Tupelo and moved to Memphis, Tennessee, searching for a new life. The move was made with little more than hope and a suitcase of clothes. The city was different, alive, bustling, full of opportunities the countryside could never offer. They settled in a modest housing project called Lauderdale Courts, home to low-income families. It was there that young Elvis began to see a world beyond poverty. In Memphis, music was everywhere. The blues from the street corners, the gospel from black churches, and the country songs on the radio created a melting pot of sound that captivated him. He spent hours listening and trying to reproduce what he heard on his cheap guitar. Neighbors remembered seeing Elvis sitting on the building's steps playing alone, shy but deeply focused. He was different, introspective, carrying within him the weight of changing his family's destiny. Vernon and Gladys, even through hardship, were proud of their son. Gladys believed Elvis's talent was a gift from God, and that faith fueled the boy. Still, the fear of failure was always there. Elvis grew up convinced he had to succeed, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. He saw success as a way to guarantee security. He knew that if he had money and recognition, nothing and no one could ever take stability away from him again. During his teenage years, Elvis worked to help at home. He was a delivery boy, a clerk, and a driver. He saved as much as he could and gave most of his earnings to his parents. The promise he had made as a child remained alive: never let his mother suffer again. That promise, fed by memories of scarcity, became the driving force behind his adult life. Every note he sang, every performance he gave, carried the silent echo of his childhood. The sound of his mother crying, the image of his father leaving through the door, the emptiness of their home. While most young people his age dreamed of leaving Memphis to seek adventure, Elvis dreamed of returning one day, with pride. He wanted to rewrite his family's story, to prove that a Presley could be great, respected, and worthy. The fear of poverty was not just a ghost, it was the force that pushed him forward. He didn't chase fame for the glitter of the spotlight, but for the certainty that it would be his shield against the suffering he had known as a boy. It was during this stage that Elvis transformed. The boy from Tupelo gave way to a young man forged by necessity, faith, and pain. His father's imprisonment and his mother's struggle had left deep marks, but they also created a man with purpose. He carried within him the memory of every tear he saw and every day of hunger he endured. And he swore, without ever saying it out loud, that he would do everything in his power to make sure his family never knew misery again. That silent oath was the starting point for the birth of the artist who would change the world. Do you think this fear of returning to poverty was what truly drove Elvis to become the icon we know today? Leave your opinion in the comments. I want to know what you think about this part of his journey. Elvis Presley's success hit like an explosion. Suddenly, that shy young man from Memphis was on the radio, on television, on magazine covers. But behind the applause and fame, there was still the boy from Tupelo, the one who had grown up afraid of poverty, haunted by his father's imprisonment, and anchored by his mother's love. The spotlight didn't erase those memories. On the contrary, it turned them into both his strength and his burden for life.